Hey there! Welcome to Lurkbound. I'm so glad you're here. There's something about the quiet parts of the world, the places people don't usually look, that holds the most chilling secrets. Tonight, I've put together a collection of true accounts that prove sometimes the things we fear aren't just in our heads. They're out there, waiting in the silence. I'm always curious to see how far these stories travel, so definitely let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. And if you're a fan of these kinds of stories, feel free to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It's the best way to support what I do here. Now, make sure your doors are locked, settle in, and let's see what's lurking in the dark. A couple of years ago, something happened to me that still sits heavy in my chest whenever I think about it. Even now I can remember the feeling with uncomfortable clarity, the way fear slowly replaced confusion, and how quickly an ordinary night turned into something I will never fully forget. It was around 3 in the morning when I woke up. There was nothing dramatic about it at first, no loud noise, no nightmare that jolted me awake. It was that strange, half-aware feeling where you open your eyes without knowing why. The room was dark, quiet and still, the kind of silence you expect in the middle of the night when the world feels paused. I lay there for a second, trying to get my bearings, my mind foggy and slow, still caught between sleep and being awake. That was when I saw it. A figure walked past my bedroom door. At first, my brain didn't react the way you might expect. I didn't scream or jump up. I didn't even feel fear right away. I was so groggy that my thoughts went straight to the most logical, least threatening explanation. I assumed it was my boyfriend. Sometimes he would come over late, and in my half-asleep state, it didn't seem impossible that he had let himself in while I was sleeping. My eyes followed the movement, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. My heart still calm, my body still relaxed under the covers. Without really thinking, I called out. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, thick and slow with sleep. I said his name, expecting an answer, expecting to hear his voice or the sound of footsteps stopping. Instead, there was nothing, no response, not even a noise. That was the first moment something felt wrong. I lay there for another second, listening carefully. The house was quiet again, too quiet. I told myself maybe he hadn't heard me. Maybe he was in the bathroom or the front room. Still half convinced everything was normal, I pushed the covers back and got out of bed. I didn't grab my phone. I didn't grab anything I could use to protect myself. Looking back, that feels incredibly reckless, but at the time my brain simply wasn't operating at full speed. Fear hadn't fully set in yet, and when fear isn't there, you don't act like you should. I stepped out into the hallway. The air felt colder than it had in my bedroom, and the floor beneath my feet felt unfamiliar, like I was walking through someone else's house instead of my own. That's when I noticed the light in the front room was on. That alone should have set off alarm bells, but again, I brushed it off. I thought maybe my boyfriend had turned it on. Maybe he was waiting for me. Maybe this was all just a misunderstanding. I walked into the front room. There was a man standing there. He wasn't someone I recognized. He wasn't my boyfriend. He wasn't anyone I had ever seen before in my life. He was standing completely still, facing one of the walls, just staring at it. The light cast a strange shadow around him, and for a moment I couldn't even process what I was seeing. My brain kept trying to force the situation into something familiar, something safe. It took a few long seconds for the reality to sink in. There was a random man in my home in the middle of the night. I asked him who he was. My voice shook slightly, though I didn't fully realize it at the time. I was still clinging to the idea that there was some explanation, that maybe he would turn around and say he was looking for someone else, or that he had the wrong house, or anything that would make this make sense. He didn't answer. He didn't move. He didn't look at me. He just kept staring at the wall as if I wasn't even there. That was the moment my body caught up with my mind. A wave of fear hit me all at once, sharp and overwhelming. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My mouth went dry. Every instinct in me screamed that I was not safe. I realized how exposed I was, how alone I was, and how badly things could go wrong. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I turned around and ran. I ran back to my bedroom as fast as I could, my legs shaking, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I slammed the door behind me and grabbed my phone from the bedside table with trembling hands. I didn't stop to think, didn't stop to calm myself down. I just knew I needed help, and I needed it immediately. I ran outside while dialing the police, not wanting to stay in the house for another second. The cool night air hit my skin, and I remember standing there barefoot, barely feeling the ground beneath me, focused only on the voice on the other end of the line. I tried to explain what was happening, my words tumbling over each other, my voice shaking with fear. There was a stranger in my house. I didn't know who he was. He wouldn't answer me. The police arrived within a few minutes, though at the time it felt much longer. Every second I stood outside felt stretched and unreal. I kept looking at the front door, say half expecting the man to come out, half terrified of what would happen if he did. When the police finally pulled up, relief washed over me so strongly I nearly collapsed. They went inside while I stayed outside, wrapped in a blanket, answering questions and trying to steady my breathing. Eventually, they brought the man out. Up close, he looked confused and disconnected, like he wasn't fully aware of where he was or what was happening. The officers explained that he was mentally ill. He wasn't aggressive, and he didn't seem to understand that he was in someone else's home. Even so, that knowledge didn't erase the fear I had felt. It didn't undo the image of him standing silently in my living room, staring at the wall, refusing to respond. It didn't change the fact that a stranger had been inside my home while I was asleep. To this day, neither the police nor I know how he got in. There were no clear signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no smashed windows. The idea that someone could enter my home so easily without my knowledge is something that still unsettles me. It makes you question your sense of safety in a way that's hard to describe to anyone who hasn't experienced it. For a long time after that night, I struggled to sleep. Every small noise made my heart race. I checked the locks over and over before going to bed. Sometimes I would wake up suddenly, convinced I'd heard footsteps or seen movement in the hallway, only to realize it was nothing. My home, which had always been a place of comfort, suddenly felt fragile, like a barrier that could be crossed at any moment. I replayed the night in my head again and again, thinking about the choices I made. I thought about how easily things could have gone differently. What if I had walked closer to him? What if he had reacted differently when I spoke? What if I hadn't run back to my bedroom in time? Those questions don't have answers, and maybe that's what makes them so unsettling. At the same time, I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the fact that he was mentally ill, that he may not have meant any harm, that he may have been confused or scared himself. It added another layer to the experience, a mix of fear and sadness that was hard to process. I could acknowledge that he wasn't acting out of malice while still recognizing how terrifying the situation was for me. Even now, years later, the memory feels vivid. I can still picture the way the light looked in the front room, the stillness of his posture, the silence when I asked who he was. I can still feel the panic rising in my chest as reality hit me. Experiences like that don't fade easily. They change you in subtle ways, making you more cautious, more aware of your surroundings, and more aware of how quickly normal life can be disrupted. That night taught me how thin the line between safety and danger can be. It showed me how vulnerable you can be in a place where you least expect it. And it left me with a story I never wanted to have, but one I will always remember. a reminder of a moment when everything felt out of control, and I was forced to act on instinct just to protect myself. I was around 21 or 22 years old at the time, living completely on my own for the first time. It was one of those stages in life where independence feels exciting rather than scary. I had my own place, my own routine, and the quiet felt comforting instead of lonely. I didn't think of myself as careless, but I definitely trusted the world more back then than I do now. That night felt especially peaceful. The weather was mild, the kind of night where the air feels soft and comfortable instead of cold or heavy. I remember opening my bedroom window to let the breeze in before going to sleep. The window was low enough to the ground that, technically, someone could get in if they really tried, but it never crossed my mind as a real concern. The screen was tight and not easy to remove, and the neighborhood had always felt safe. Nothing bad had ever happened there. I'd slept with that window open plenty of times before without a second thought. I went to bed like normal, relaxed and tired, expecting nothing more than a quiet night of sleep. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up. It wasn't sudden or panicked at first. It was that slow, half-awake kind of waking where you're not even sure what pulled you out of sleep. For a few seconds, I just lay there, disoriented, trying to figure out why my body had decided to wake up. Then it hit me. I smelled smoke. That alone was confusing. My first groggy thought was that something outside must be burning, or maybe a neighbor was smoking nearby, and the smell drifted in through the open window. My brain was still foggy, still trying to piece things together without any urgency. I didn't feel scared yet. I was annoyed more than anything, thinking the smell might make it hard to fall back asleep. Without fully sitting up, I reached out toward my bedside table to turn on my lamp. My hand didn't find the lamp. Instead, it touched something warm and solid. For a split second, my brain refused to process what my hand was telling it. There was a brief moment of confusion, like my senses and my thoughts were out of sync. Then, reality snapped into focus all at once. My body went rigid. My heart slammed against my chest. Every ounce of sleep vanished instantly. There was a person in my bed, not just in my room, not standing nearby. In my bed. My eyes adjusted just enough for me to see him. A shirtless man was sitting there, smoking a cigarette, staring directly at me. The glow from the cigarette faintly lit his face, making the whole scene feel unreal, like something pulled straight out of a nightmare. He didn't look startled to be there. He didn't look rushed. He was just watching me, calm and silent, as if this was completely normal. I don't know how long that moment lasted. It could have been a second or 10 seconds. Time felt distorted. My mind raced through 1,000 thoughts at once, none of them fully forming into something useful. All I knew was that this was wrong. Horrifyingly wrong. I screamed at him to get out. The sound came out raw and panicked, louder than I expected. I didn't plan it. It was pure instinct, fear forcing the words out of me before I could think. The noise seemed to snap him out of whatever mindset he was in. His expression changed instantly, shock flashing across his face. In that moment, I realized something strange and unsettling. I had scared him too. He reacted fast, faster than I could even process. He jumped up, moved toward the window, and leapt out of it in one fluid motion. There was no struggle, no hesitation, no attempt to say anything. 1 second he was there, and the next he was gone, disappearing into the darkness outside. I sat there frozen for a heartbeat, my body shaking, my ears ringing. Then survival instinct kicked in again. I jumped out of bed, ran to the window, and slammed it shut as hard as I could. My hands were trembling so badly it took effort just to lock it. Once it was closed, I grabbed the nearest heavy piece of furniture I could manage on my own, a bookcase, and dragged it in front of the window. The scraping sound against the floor felt unbearably loud in the silence of the night. Only after that did I stop moving. I stood there, breathing hard, my chest tight, my entire body buzzing with adrenaline. My room no longer felt like my room. It felt exposed, violated. I didn't feel safe sitting down, but I also didn't know what else to do. Every shadow looked threatening. Every sound outside made my heart jump. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat there until morning, lights on, back against the wall, jumping at every creak and noise. My mind kept replaying what had happened over and over, trying to understand it, trying to make sense of something that felt impossible. How long had he been there before I woke up? Had he been watching me sleep? Had he climbed in while I was already asleep, or had he been there longer than that? Those questions spiraled endlessly, each one worse than the last. When daylight finally came, it didn't bring the relief I expected. The fear didn't disappear just because the sun was up. I went outside, my body still tense, and looked around the window. That's when I saw the screen. It was sitting neatly against the side of the house, removed completely. That confirmed what I already knew but didn't want to accept. He hadn't just wandered in by accident. He had deliberately taken the screen off, climbed into my bedroom, and sat there long enough to smoke a cigarette. The smell that woke me up wasn't drifting in from outside. It was coming from him, inside my room, inches away from me while I slept. That realization made me feel sick. The worst part was not knowing his intention. I still don't know what he planned to do. I don't know if he was there to rob me, to hurt me, or something even worse. I don't know if my waking up saved me from something terrible, or if he never planned to do anything at all. That uncertainty is its own kind of torment. It leaves room for your imagination to fill in the gaps, and your imagination is rarely kind. What haunts me most is the thought of how easily it could have gone differently. What if I hadn't woken up when I did? What if I hadn't smelled the smoke? What if my hand hadn't touched him? How many minutes or hours might he have been there before I stirred? And even worse, how many times could something like that have happened before without me ever knowing? After that night, everything changed. I never slept with a window open again. Not really. Even on the hottest nights, the most I'll allow is a tiny crack, just enough for a hint of air, and even then it makes me uneasy. I check locks obsessively. I make sure windows are secured before I even think about getting into bed. It's not a conscious choice anymore. It's automatic. I also refuse to live on the ground floor of any building. It doesn't matter how nice the place is or how safe the area seems. I won't do it. That sense of vulnerability, of being easily accessible, is something I can't shake. Higher floors feel safer, even if that safety is partly psychological. For a long time, I felt embarrassed talking about it. I worried people would think I was overreacting or being paranoid, but fear like that doesn't care about logic. It embeds itself deep in your body and stays there. Even years later, certain smells, like cigarette smoke at night, can make my stomach drop. Sometimes I'll wake up suddenly, heart racing, convinced for a split second that someone is in the room with me. That night took away a kind of innocence I didn't even realize I had. Before, sleep was just sleep. My bedroom was just a bedroom. Afterward, those things felt fragile. I became painfully aware of how exposed we are when we sleep, how defenseless, how much we trust the walls around us to protect us. I also became more aware of how random danger can be. I didn't do anything reckless. I didn't live in a dangerous area. I didn't invite trouble in. I just opened a window on a nice night and trusted that it would be fine, like I always had. That's what makes it so unsettling. It wasn't a series of bad decisions. It was normal life, interrupted by something unimaginable. Even now I sometimes think about him. I wonder who he was, where he went, on whether he ever did something worse to someone else. I wonder if he remembers me, if that moment scared him enough to stop, or if it was just another close call in a pattern of behavior? I'll never know, and that lack of closure lingers. What I do know is how that moment shaped me. It made me cautious in ways I wasn't before. It made me protective of my space, my privacy, my safety. It taught me that feeling safe and being safe aren't always the same thing. Most of all, it left me with a question that still sends a chill through me whenever I let myself think about it too long. If I hadn't woken up that night, would I ever have known he was there at all? A couple of years ago, back when I was working afternoon shifts, something happened that completely changed the way I think about feeling safe in my own home. At the time, my schedule was pretty consistent. I usually worked later in the day, which meant my mornings were slow and quiet. That particular day started like any other, ordinary in every possible way, with nothing to suggest it would turn into one of the strangest and most unsettling experiences of my life. I woke up around 10 in the morning, still groggy and half asleep. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels normal when you know everyone else is either asleep or out for the day. I didn't rush to get out of bed. Instead, I reached for the remote and turned on the TV, settling in to watch American Dad. It was one of those comfort shows I'd seen 100 times, something familiar that didn't require much attention. I lay there in bed, letting the noise of the show fill the room while my brain slowly woke up. I remember feeling completely relaxed. There was no tension, no sense of urgency. I wasn't worried about anything. I hadn't even started thinking about work yet. I was just enjoying the quiet freedom of having the house to myself for a little while longer. At least, that's what I thought. Not long after I turned the TV on, I heard the sound of the back door opening. Normally, that wouldn't have meant anything. In our house, we almost always used the back door. It was just how things were done. People came and went through it all the time, so hearing it open wasn't unusual or alarming. My immediate assumption was that my mum had come home early or stepped back inside for something she forgot. I didn't question it. I didn't even pause the TV. It registered as background noise, nothing more. Then I heard footsteps. They were coming from downstairs, moving toward the staircase. Again, I didn't feel scared. My bedroom was on the second floor, and I figured my mom was just coming up to grab something or check on me. I was still lying there watching TV, completely at ease. It's strange how the mind fills in gaps with familiar explanations when you feel safe. Even though no one was supposed to be home yet, I didn't challenge that thought. I just accepted it. As the footsteps got closer, I called out, saying my mom's name. I expected to hear her answer back, maybe ask why I was still in bed or tell me she'd be leaving again soon. Instead, there was silence. That was the first moment something felt slightly off. I waited a second and called out again, a little louder this time. Still, no response. The footsteps continued, steady and deliberate, moving closer to my room. A faint sense of confusion crept in, but it wasn't fear yet. I told myself maybe she hadn't heard me. Maybe she was distracted or talking on the phone. There were plenty of explanations, and my brain clung to them. Then my bedroom door slowly cracked open. It didn't swing wide or burst open. It just opened enough for someone to peek inside. A head appeared in the doorway, and the second I saw him, everything inside me shifted. This was not my mom. This was not anyone I knew. It was a man, probably in his early 30s. He had a blonde beard and long, greasy hair that hung around his face in a way that immediately made my stomach drop. His eyes were wide, and he looked just as shocked to see me as I was to see him. For a brief moment, we just stared at each other, frozen in place, both clearly caught off guard. At the time, I was 20 years old, about 6'3", and weighed around 260 pounds. I was sitting up in bed wearing nothing but my boxers. That detail sticks with me because of how vulnerable and exposed I felt in that moment despite my size. I hadn't had time to process what was happening or why there was a stranger standing in my bedroom doorway. My brain lagged, trying to catch up with reality. Before I could say anything, before I could even fully react, he spoke. He asked, "Is this the blank residence?" His tone was casual, almost rehearsed, like this was a question he'd asked many times before. It wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't apologetic either. It felt wrong in a way that's hard to describe, like the words didn't match the situation. My heart started pounding, and I felt a rush of adrenaline hit my system all at once. I answered instinctively. I said, "No." The word came out more like a question than a statement. I wasn't confident. I was confused, trying to understand what was happening, while also responding fast enough to keep the situation from escalating. For a split second after I spoke, he hesitated. His eyes flicked around the room, taking me in, taking in the fact that I was clearly awake and clearly not the person he expected to find. Then he turned and left. He didn't argue. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He just disappeared down the hallway and back down the stairs with surprising speed. By the time I swung my legs off the bed and stood up, my heart racing, he was already gone. I rushed to the window and looked outside, expecting to see him walking away or at least pulling out of the driveway. There was nothing. He wasn't in the driveway. He wasn't on the sidewalk. He wasn't anywhere in sight. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The entire encounter had lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt unreal, like something that hadn't fully happened yet. I stood there in silence, trying to collect my thoughts. My hands were shaking slightly, and my chest felt tight. I walked through the house, checking rooms, making sure no one else was there. The back door was still unlocked. Seeing it like that made my stomach churn. The realization hit me hard. A complete stranger had walked into my house, made his way upstairs, and opened my bedroom door while I was half awake in bed. The more I thought about it, the worse it felt. At first, I tried to brush it off. I told myself maybe it was a mistake. Maybe he really did have the wrong address. Maybe it was just some confused guy who realized his error and left. But deep down, something about the situation didn't sit right with me. The way he moved so confidently through the house. The way he didn't call out or knock. The way he went straight upstairs. Later that day, I talked to a family friend who happened to be a veteran police officer. I explained everything in detail, from the moment I heard the back door open to the second the man disappeared. As I talked, I could see his expression change. He grew more serious the more I described what happened. That's when he told me something that made my blood run cold. Apparently, there had been reports in nearby towns of a man using this exact tactic to rob people. He would walk into houses during the day, often through unlocked back doors, acting as if he belonged there. If someone confronted him, he would pretend he had the wrong address, ask a casual question, and leave quickly before anyone had time to react. If no one was home, or if he found people who seemed distracted or vulnerable, he would steal whatever he could and get out. Hearing that completely reframed the experience for me. It wasn't random. It wasn't a harmless mistake. It was deliberate. That man hadn't accidentally wandered into my house. He had chosen it. He had walked in expecting the place to be empty or easy to take advantage of. The only reason he left so quickly was because he hadn't expected to find a large or fully awake adult sitting in bed staring back at him. That realization shook me more than the encounter itself. I kept thinking about how easily things could have gone differently. What if I'd been asleep? What if I'd been wearing headphones and hadn't heard him come in? What if I had been in the shower or downstairs, completely unaware of his presence? The idea that he could have been moving around my house, touching my things, watching me without me knowing, made my skin crawl. For a long time after that, I struggled with a strange mix of emotions. There was fear, obviously, but there was also anger. Anger that someone had violated my home so casually. Anger that it had been so easy for him to get inside. And beneath all of that, there was a lingering sense of vulnerability I hadn't felt before. I started locking the back door religiously, even during the day, even when I was home. I double-checked it constantly, sometimes going back to make sure it was locked, even though I knew it was. Small noises made me jump. Footsteps outside, doors closing in the distance, anything unexpected immediately put me on edge. What bothered me most was how normal everything had felt right up until the moment it wasn't. I had been lying in bed, watching a cartoon, feeling completely safe. There were no warning signs, no sudden crash or loud noise, just the quiet sound of a door opening and footsteps climbing the stairs. It made me realize how thin the line is between feeling secure and being exposed. Even now, years later, I still think about that moment when our eyes met in the doorway. The shock on his face, the speed with which he disappeared, the unsettling calm of his question. It replays in my mind sometimes, especially when I'm home alone during the day. That experience taught me a hard lesson about complacency and assumptions, about how easily we convince ourselves that everything is fine because it usually is. It showed me that danger doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it slips in quietly, wearing the mask of normalcy, relying on routine and trust to go unnoticed. I was lucky that day. Lucky that I was awake. Lucky that I was visible. Lucky that he decided to leave. But luck isn't something you want to rely on when it comes to your safety. That's something I learned the hard way, in a moment that started with a cartoon on TV and ended with a truth I won't ever forget. A month before my husband officially moved in with me, I was already living in our house, trying to settle in and make it feel like home. Those first weeks were filled with small projects and plans, the kind of things you do when you're excited about a new chapter in life. One afternoon, I decided to paint the guest room. It felt productive and comforting, like I was putting my own mark on the place before our life together truly began. It was a warm day, so I opened the windows wide to let in fresh air. The breeze felt nice against my skin, and sunlight poured into the room, making the whole space feel bright and calm. I put on some music, turned it up just enough to enjoy it, and focused on painting. I was completely absorbed in what I was doing, moving the brush back and forth, lost in my thoughts. Time slipped by without me really noticing. I wasn't checking the clock, and I didn't feel rushed or uneasy. I felt safe. It was my house after all. At some point, without realizing how much time had passed, the light in the room began to change. The bright afternoon glow slowly faded into something dimmer and softer. It wasn't until I paused to step back and look at my work that I noticed it had gotten dark outside. That realization alone didn't scare me. It just surprised me. I hadn't meant to work that long, but it didn't seem like a big deal. As I moved toward the windows to close them, I heard the sound of leaves crunching outside. It registered in my mind, but I didn't react with fear. We lived in a neighborhood where people were always out walking their dogs, especially in the early evening. So footsteps and rustling leaves were normal background noise. I didn't think twice about it. I was still relaxed, still focused on simple things like finishing the room and cleaning up my supplies. I reached the window and looked outside, expecting to see nothing unusual. Instead, I saw a man standing in my backyard. He was under the tree, maybe 5 feet away from the back door, close enough that the distance between us felt shockingly small. He was looking up at me, completely still, his attention fixed on where I stood at the window. For a split second, my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. It felt unreal, like my mind was lagging behind reality. Then everything hit me at once. My body reacted before I could think. I fell straight to the floor, my heart slamming against my chest so hard it felt like it might burst. The room suddenly felt too open, too exposed. As I lay there, another terrifying realization rushed through my mind. The back glass door was probably open. I had likely left it that way for airflow, meaning there was nothing between that man and the inside of my house, except a flimsy screen. A screen he could have easily pushed through without effort. That thought alone made me feel sick. The idea that he could simply walk into my home, that there was almost nothing stopping him, sent a wave of panic through my entire body. I couldn't stand up. My legs felt weak and unresponsive, like they didn't belong to me anymore. I stayed low, pressing myself against the floor, trying to make myself as small and invisible as possible. I crawled across the floor to reach my phone, every movement slow and shaky. I didn't want to stand up. I didn't want to make any noise that might let him know exactly where I was. My hands trembled as I grabbed my phone, and I immediately called my husband. I don't even remember exactly what I said when he answered. My voice was panicked, probably barely understandable, but he knew something was terribly wrong. As soon as he understood what was happening, he told me to stay where I was and not move. He called 911 while getting into his car, rushing home as fast as he could. Knowing he was on his way helped, but it didn't erase the fear. I was still alone in that house on the floor, not knowing if the man was still there, not knowing what he might do next. What made the situation even more disturbing was the fact that our yard was surrounded by a 6-foot-tall fence. This wasn't a place someone could just wander into by accident. This person had made a deliberate choice to hop the fence and enter our property. He hadn't been passing by. He hadn't been lost. He had climbed into our yard to watch me. That thought stayed with me, heavy and terrifying. He had seen me through the windows while I was painting, unaware, relaxed, completely vulnerable. He had been close enough to observe me without me knowing, and that realization made my skin crawl. It felt like my privacy had been violated in the most unsettling way. I stayed on the floor until help arrived. When my husband finally got home, followed shortly by the police, the man was gone. He had disappeared as quietly as he had arrived. There was no confrontation, no explanation, no answers. Just a lingering fear and the knowledge that someone had been there, watching, and had chosen to leave on his own terms. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head. The image of him standing under the tree, staring up at me, felt burned into my memory. I kept thinking about how close he was to the door, how easily things could have gone differently. What if I had taken longer to notice it was dark outside? What if I had walked into the kitchen instead of going to close the windows? What if he had decided not to leave? Those questions haunted me. For months afterwards, sleep didn't come easily. Nighttime became something I dreaded instead of welcomed. Every sound outside made my heart race. The crunch of leaves, the creak of the house settling, even distant noises from the neighborhood felt threatening. I checked the locks repeatedly before going to bed, I sometimes getting up multiple times just to make sure everything was secure. Even then, I didn't feel safe. I avoided opening windows, even during the day. When I did, I constantly looked over my shoulder, scanning the yard, making sure no one was there. The backyard, which should have been a peaceful private space, now felt exposed and uncomfortable. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even when I knew logically that I was alone. The emotional impact lingered longer than I expected. It wasn't just fear, it was a loss of trust in my surroundings. My home no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt fragile, like something that could be breached at any moment. I became hyper-aware of how easily safety can be disrupted, how quickly a normal, peaceful day can turn into something terrifying. I also struggled with guilt and self-blame, even though I knew it wasn't rational. I replayed my actions over and over, wondering if I had been careless. I questioned why I hadn't noticed him sooner, why I had assumed the sounds outside were harmless, why I had left the door open. Intellectually, I knew none of it was my fault. Emotionally, it was harder to accept. As time went on, the fear slowly softened, but it never fully disappeared. Even now, the memory still makes my stomach tighten. I'm more cautious, more alert, more aware of my surroundings than I used to be. That experience changed the way I move through my own space, the way I think about safety, and the way I understand vulnerability. What stays with me the most is how ordinary the day was before everything changed. I was just painting a room, listening to music, enjoying a quiet moment alone. There were no warning signs, no sense of danger until it was right in front of me. That contrast is what makes the memory so unsettling. It's a reminder that fear doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it appears silently, standing under a tree, watching, waiting, and leaving behind a lasting sense of unease that takes a long time to fade. I was 19 years old, freshly independent, and living on my own for the first time. It was my first apartment, the kind of place that feels huge when you're young, even though it really isn't. I had moved far away from home, all the way across the country, because I wanted to prove to myself that I could handle adult life on my own. I had a small living room, a bedroom just big enough for a bed and dresser, and a front door that suddenly felt a lot thinner than I ever imagined it would. It was a quiet evening, nothing unusual about it at all. I was home alone, probably watching TV or scrolling on my phone, just enjoying the calm. The neighborhood was considered a nice one. Clean buildings, trimmed lawns, no loud parties, no obvious trouble. That sense of safety was one of the reasons I had chosen the place. I genuinely believed nothing bad could happen there, especially not to me. Then there was a knock at the door. At first, I didn't think much of it. People knock on doors all the time. Maybe a neighbor, maybe someone at the wrong apartment, maybe a delivery. I stood up and walked over slowly, already feeling that small instinctive hesitation you get when you're alone. I leaned in and looked through the peephole. On the other side was a man I didn't recognize. He was large, heavy-set, and standing way too close to the door. His posture felt aggressive even before he spoke. As soon as he realized someone was inside, his face changed. He started yelling almost immediately, his voice loud and angry, filling the hallway. He screamed at me to open the door. At first I froze. My brain couldn't fully process what was happening. This wasn't a normal knock. This wasn't someone asking politely or even impatiently. He was shouting, threatening, his words slurred but full of rage. He said he was going to beat me up. He said he would kick the door down if I didn't open it right now. Each sentence felt louder than the last, like he was trying to force his way into my space, using only his voice. My heart started racing so fast I could feel it in my throat. I backed away from the door without taking my eyes off it, suddenly very aware of how alone I was. I didn't answer him. I didn't move toward the lock. Every instinct in my body screamed that opening that door would be the worst decision I could make. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and called the police. As the phone rang, his yelling turned into something worse. It was like he could sense that I wasn't going to comply. The anger escalated quickly. The moment someone picked up on the other end and I started trying to explain what was happening, the man threw his full body against my door. The sound was terrifying. It wasn't just banging, it was the sound of a grown man slamming his weight into a barrier that was the only thing between me and him. The door shook in its frame. Each impact echoed through the apartment. I remember screaming and crying at the same time, trying to speak clearly enough for the dispatcher to understand me while my hands trembled so badly I could barely hold the phone. I truly believed the door might give in. In those moments, time felt distorted. Every second felt endless, but everything was happening too fast. I kept backing away, or looking around my apartment like I was trying to find somewhere to hide, even though I knew there was nowhere to go. The walls felt too close. The silence between each slam was almost worse than the noise itself, because I never knew when the next one would hit. The dispatcher stayed on the line with me, calm and steady, telling me that officers were on the way. I clung to that voice like it was a lifeline. Outside, the man continued yelling, threatening, pounding. His words blurred together, but the intent was unmistakable. He wanted inside. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence was so abrupt it was jarring. I stood there shaking, phone still pressed to my ear, barely breathing. A few seconds later, I heard sirens approaching, faint at first, then louder. Almost immediately after that, footsteps moved away from my door. I didn't move. I didn't look through the peephole again. I just stood there, crying, waiting. Within minutes, there were police officers in the hallway. I could hear them talking loudly, commanding someone to stop, to turn around, to put their hands up. Eventually, one of the officers knocked on my door, this time firmly but calmly, and identified himself. Only then did I feel safe enough to approach. When I opened the door, there were multiple officers standing there, 5 of them at least. Seeing that many people in uniform was overwhelming, but also a relief so strong it made my knees weak. They told me they had caught the man at the bottom of the stairs. He hadn't gotten far. Later, they explained what had happened. He was extremely intoxicated and had come to my apartment looking for the previous renter. Apparently, he thought they still lived there. Whether that was true or not almost didn't matter. What mattered was that he had chosen my door, my apartment, my life to unleash that rage on. They arrested him, and I watched from inside as they led him away. Even then, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. After the officers left, my apartment felt different. The walls no longer felt like protection. The door didn't feel strong. Every sound made me jump. I didn't sleep that night, not really. I sat on my bed with the lights on, replaying everything over and over in my head. I kept imagining what would have happened if the door had broken, if the police had taken longer, if I had hesitated to call. In the days that followed, the fear didn't fade. It settled into me. Every knock made my stomach drop. Every noise in the hallway made me tense. I stopped feeling comfortable in my own space, and that was the worst part. The place that was supposed to represent independence and freedom now felt like a constant reminder of how vulnerable I really was. 3 months later, I broke my lease. I couldn't stay there anymore. No matter how nice the neighborhood was, no matter how safe people said it was, my sense of security was gone. I packed my things and moved out, feeling both ashamed and relieved. I hated that fear had pushed me out, but I also knew I needed to feel safe again. Being so far from my family suddenly felt unbearable. That night had shown me just how alone I really was, and how quickly things can turn terrifying without warning. I had wanted independence so badly, but in that moment, all I wanted was to be back home, surrounded by people who loved me, behind doors that felt solid again. Even now, years later, I still think about that knock, about how ordinary the evening was before it happened, about how thin the line is between feeling safe and realizing you're not. It changed the way I see the world, and it taught me that danger doesn't always announce itself in obvious ways. Sometimes it just knocks, and everything after that is never quite the same. I am sorry for the interruption. I hate breaking the flow, but I am curious. Do you believe there is some truth to every story like this? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to hear more, please subscribe. Okay, let's get back to it. My boyfriend used to work away from home a lot back then, sometimes for days at a time. I had mostly gotten used to it, but there was always one thing I could never quite shake. The first night he was gone was always the hardest. No matter how tired I was, sleep never came easily. The house felt different without another person in it. The quiet felt heavier, the shadows seemed deeper, and every small sound felt louder than it should have. That night was no different. I remember going to bed already feeling uneasy, knowing he wouldn't be there. I locked the doors like I always did, checked the windows, and tried to reassure myself that everything was fine. We lived in a quiet area, the kind of neighborhood where nothing really happened. Families, gardens, familiar faces. Or it was the last place you'd expect trouble to show up in the middle of the night. Still, I lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the house settling. Eventually, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I remember is being jolted awake by noise. At first, my brain couldn't make sense of it. There was shouting, a man's voice, loud and angry, cutting through the night. Then came the sound of something heavy being struck. It sounded like fists or boots hitting wood. A door, maybe. The noise was sharp and aggressive, not something you could confuse with people laughing or messing around. My heart immediately started racing. For a few seconds I lay there frozen, trying to listen without moving. I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Someone drunk? A late-night argument? Or anything but what my fear was already whispering to me. Then the banging happened again. I shot up out of bed. I didn't even think about putting on shoes or grabbing my phone at first. Pure instinct took over. I went straight to my bedroom window and pulled the curtain back just enough to look outside. That was my first mistake, because I saw him. A man dressed entirely in black was walking through our garden. Not rushing, not stumbling, but moving with purpose, straight toward the house. The darkness made him blend into the night, but there was no mistaking the shape of him. His hood was up, his hands were at his sides, and he was close enough that I could clearly see his outline against the faint glow of the street lights beyond the fence. I felt like my chest collapsed in on itself. My mind screamed danger. I pulled back from the window immediately, my hands shaking so badly I had to press them against my thighs to steady myself. Every nerve in my body was alive, buzzing with fear. The house that had felt merely lonely minutes earlier now felt like a trap. I needed to know where he was going. I ran to the front of the house, careful to keep the lights off, and peered through the front window. I stayed back from the glass, barely lifting the curtain. My breath came fast and shallow as I searched the street. A moment later, I saw him. He emerged from the side of the house and walked past the front garden, heading away from me. For a brief second, relief washed over me so strongly, my knees nearly buckled. He was leaving. Maybe he hadn't even noticed the house at all. Then, my relief vanished. From the opposite direction, another man appeared, and he was also dressed entirely in black. The two of them walked toward each other, met directly outside my house, and stopped. I remember gripping the edge of the windowsill so hard my fingers hurt. They stood close together, their heads bent slightly as if speaking quietly. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the body language was unmistakable. They knew each other, they were together, and they were right outside my home. I stepped back from the window, my whole body trembling. The fear was overwhelming now, flooding every thought. I was alone. My boyfriend was miles away. There was no one else in the house. Two strangers had just met up outside my door in the middle of the night after I'd heard shouting and banging. Every worst-case scenario raced through my head. I grabbed my phone and called the police. My voice shook as I tried to explain what I'd seen. I gave the address, described the men, told them I was alone and terrified. The operator stayed calm, her voice steady and reassuring, telling me officers were already on their way and to stay inside, keep the doors locked, and move to a safe place. The minutes that followed felt endless. I sat on the stairs with my back against the wall, phone clutched in my hand, listening intently. Every sound made me flinch. I expected at any moment to hear footsteps, a knock, a crash of glass. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then, faintly, I heard sirens. Relief hit me so fast it made me dizzy. Within minutes, police cars were outside, blue lights flashing against the walls of my house. Officers moved quickly, methodically, checking the front and then the back of the property. They searched the garden, shining torches along the fence line, checking gates and corners. I stayed inside until one of them knocked and told me it was safe to come down. Both men were gone. The officers asked me to explain again what I'd seen, what I'd heard. As I talked, the fear slowly started to drain out of me, replaced by a strange, shaky exhaustion. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like my sense of safety had been ripped away. That's when they told me what had happened. A neighbor down the street had caught two men trying to steal his car. When he confronted them, one of the men ran straight through the back gardens, hopping fences to escape. The other took off down the road. They had split up to get away from the scene. My garden had simply been part of the escape route. The shouting I'd heard was the neighbor yelling. The banging was the struggle around the car. The man I'd seen in my garden was running blind, cutting through properties to avoid being caught. The second man had looped around through the streets, and the two of them had met up again outside my house by chance. Logically, it all made sense. Emotionally, it didn't matter. I didn't sleep at all that night. Even after the police left, even after the street returned to silence, my body refused to calm down. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that dark figure moving through the garden. I replayed the moment they met outside my house over and over again, wondering what might have happened if things had gone slightly differently. What if they'd decided to try my door? What if I hadn't woken up? What if the police had taken longer? The morning eventually came, pale and quiet, but it didn't bring comfort. The house felt wrong now, too open, too exposed. I jumped at every noise, checked the locks repeatedly, and stayed glued to my phone. The next night, my brother came to stay with me. Just knowing someone else was in the house made an enormous difference. I still didn't sleep well, but I slept enough to function. The fear slowly dulled over the following days, but it never fully disappeared. That experience changed me. I became more cautious, more aware. I stopped brushing off strange sounds. I learned how quickly normal can turn into terrifying, how fast safety can vanish when you're alone and vulnerable. Years later, I moved into an apartment. People sometimes ask why I prefer it, why I don't miss having a garden or more space. I usually just smile and say it feels safer, and it does. More doors between me and the outside, more neighbors close by, more lights, more noise, more barriers. But the real reason is that night. That moment of looking out the window and seeing a stranger walking through my garden toward my house, followed by another one meeting him outside my door. That memory never really leaves you. It just fades into the background, a quiet reminder of how thin the line between ordinary and terrifying can be. And even now, when I'm alone at night, part of me still listens for footsteps outside, just in case. I was around 14 years old when it happened, still young enough that being home alone at night felt like a big deal, but old enough that my parents trusted me for a few hours on my own. It was one of those ordinary evenings that didn't feel memorable at all at the time. Nothing about the night suggested it was about to turn into one of those memories that sticks with you for years. It was around 10 at night. The house was quiet and my parents were out. I don't even remember where they were, which says a lot about how normal the situation felt. I was hungry and half distracted, standing in the kitchen making myself a bowl of cereal. The lights inside were on, but outside it was completely dark. The kind of dark where the windows turn into mirrors once the sun goes down. I remember feeling relaxed, bored maybe. It definitely not scared. I was just standing there, pouring cereal into a bowl, when everything changed in a single second. Out of nowhere, the loudest sound I have ever heard exploded through the kitchen. There was no warning, no build-up, just an instant, violent crash that felt like it shook the entire house. Before my brain could even process what the noise was, glass flew everywhere. A hammer came straight through the kitchen window. It didn't just crack the glass, it shattered it completely. The window blew inward, fragments spraying across the counter, the floor, even into the sink. The sound was so loud and sharp that it felt like it punched me in the chest. For a split second, I thought something had exploded. I froze. My heart was racing so fast, it felt like it might come out of my throat. My ears were ringing. Tiny pieces of glass were still falling, clinking softly as they hit the floor. The cold night air rushed in through the open space where the window used to be. I stood there, holding the cereal box, completely stunned. Then I looked toward the window. Outside, under the streetlight, I saw her. A woman was standing there, unsteady on her feet. She looked drunk, or high, or both. She wasn't running. She wasn't yelling. She just stood there for a moment, swaying slightly, like she had barely enough balance to stay upright. She mumbled something I couldn't understand, her words slurred and meaningless. And then she turned and started stumbling down the street. I didn't scream. I didn't hide. I didn't even think. Adrenaline took over completely. My brain locked onto one thought. I need to call the police. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone, and without even stepping away from the window, I dialed. I started talking as soon as someone answered, my voice fast and panicked, trying to explain that someone had just thrown a hammer through my kitchen window. As I was talking, I realized something important. The window was gone. The kitchen was wide open to the street. Anyone could see straight inside my house now. Anyone could climb through if they wanted to. And the person who had done this was still right there, just a short distance away, stumbling down the road. I could see her clearly through the broken window. The streetlight lit her up enough that I could tell she wasn't some big, threatening figure. She was small, thin, fragile-looking. She moved like she could barely see where she was going, like her body wasn't fully listening to her anymore. She didn't look strong. She didn't look fast. She didn't even look fully aware of what she had just done. That's when I made a decision that, looking back, probably wasn't the smartest thing in the world. I followed her. I didn't run after her aggressively or confront her. I stayed at a distance, keeping her in sight while I stayed on the phone with the police. I remember my heart pounding, my legs feeling weak but somehow still moving. Every step felt unreal, like I was watching myself do it from outside my body. Part of me knew this was dangerous. Another part of me didn't care. The adrenaline was controlling everything. I kept telling myself that I needed answers. I needed to know why this had happened. I needed something to tell my parents that made sense. Because how do you explain to them that you were making cereal and someone randomly launched a hammer through the window? As I followed her down the street, I noticed how unstable she really was. She staggered as she walked, mumbling to herself, occasionally stopping like she had forgotten where she was going. She looked like she could barely see straight, like her world was spinning out of control. That didn't make me feel safer. If anything, it made everything more unsettling. She wasn't acting angry. She wasn't shouting threats. There was no obvious reason for what she had done. That randomness was terrifying. If she wasn't thinking clearly, there was no predicting what she might do next. I kept my distance, staying far enough back that she wouldn't notice me easily, but close enough that I wouldn't lose sight of her. And my voice shook as I gave the police updates about where we were, what she looked like, which direction she was heading. The street felt completely different than it had earlier that night. Houses that had always felt safe now looked dark and silent. Windows stared back at me like empty eyes. Every sound felt amplified. I was painfully aware that I was a 14-year-old kid, alone, walking behind a stranger who had just violently smashed my window with a hammer. At one point, she stopped and leaned against a fence, like she might collapse. She muttered something again, still impossible to understand, and laughed softly to herself. The sound sent chills down my spine. I remember thinking, what if she turns around? What if she sees me? What if she still has the hammer? But I kept walking. Eventually, police arrived. The relief hit me so hard, my knees almost gave out. Blue lights washed over the street, and officers stepped out, moving quickly toward her. She didn't resist. She barely seemed aware of what was happening. They took the hammer from her, spoke to her briefly, and guided her away. Only then did everything catch up to me. My hands started shaking uncontrollably. My throat felt tight. I suddenly felt very small, very young, and very exposed. The adrenaline faded, leaving fear and shock in its place. The officers walked me back to my house. Seeing the damage in proper light made it feel even more real. Glass was everywhere. The kitchen looked violated, like something private had been broken open. Cold air poured in through the shattered window, and the house felt unfamiliar now, like it wasn't protecting me anymore. They asked me questions. I answered as best I could, still trying to wrap my head around what had happened. They told me I'd done the right thing by calling, but also gently reminded me that following someone like that was risky. I knew they were right. When my parents came home, the look on their faces said everything. Shock, fear, anger at the situation, not at me. I tried to explain, stumbling through the story, still half in disbelief myself. Saying the words out loud made it sound unreal, like something that shouldn't happen in normal life. For a long time after that, I couldn't stand in the kitchen at night without feeling uneasy. Every loud noise made my heart jump. The sound of glass clinking would instantly bring me back to that moment, cereal box in hand, staring at a hole where a window used to be. Looking back now, I understand why people ask why I followed her. I get it. From the outside it sounds reckless, dangerous, stupid even. But in that moment, with adrenaline pumping and fear clouding my thinking, it felt like the only thing that made sense. The house was already exposed. I could see her clearly. She looked fragile and barely functional, and I desperately needed something concrete to hold on to in a situation that felt completely out of control. It wasn't bravery, it wasn't confidence, it was shock, fear, and adrenaline all tangled together. That night taught me something important at a very young age. Danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it crashes into your life without warning, shattering something ordinary and safe. And when it does, you don't always react the way you think you would. Sometimes you freeze, sometimes you run. And sometimes, for reasons you can't fully explain, you follow a stranger down a dark street, just trying to make sense of something that never should have happened in the first place. I was home from university for the summer, stuck in that strange in-between phase where you're technically an adult but still living under your parents' roof. I didn't have a job lined up yet, so my days were slow and quiet. Everyone else in the house was at work, which meant I spent most weekdays alone, passing time, enjoying the calm, and not really worrying about much of anything. We lived in a small village on a very quiet street. It was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen. People knew each other, kids rode bikes up and down the road, and strangers were noticeable simply because they didn't belong. Because of that, it was completely normal to leave doors unlocked and windows wide open during the day, especially in the summer. Fresh air flowed through the house, and there was an unspoken trust that nothing bad was going to happen in a place like this. That day started just like any other. I was downstairs, moving lazily between rooms, maybe on my phone, maybe watching something in the background. The house felt open and airy, sunlight coming in through open windows, the sound of birds and distant traffic drifting inside. There was nothing unusual about the atmosphere at all. If anything, it felt especially peaceful. Late in the afternoon, my phone rang. It was my dad. That alone wasn't strange. He would sometimes call to check in or tell me when he was heading home. I answered casually, expecting something normal. But the moment I heard his voice, I knew something was wrong. He didn't sound angry or joking. He sounded tense, controlled, but urgent. He said, "I'm just around the corner, but I'm struggling to get into the street. I'll explain when I'm home, but I need you to lock all the doors, close the windows, and go upstairs." For a second, my brain stalled. What he was saying didn't make sense. We didn't live in a bad area. There was no history of crime on our street. My dad wasn't someone who played cruel jokes, especially not ones that would scare me. And even if he did joke, this didn't sound like humor. The tone of his voice made my stomach drop. It was calm, but serious in a way that immediately shut down any instinct to question him. I didn't ask why. I didn't argue. I didn't laugh it off. I just said okay, and did exactly what he told me to do. I started moving through the house, my heart beating faster with every step. I shut windows one by one, at the sound of each latch clicking into place, suddenly feeling much louder than usual. I locked the doors, double-checking them even though I'd never felt the need to do that before in broad daylight. The house, which had felt open and relaxed just minutes earlier, now felt sealed and tense, like it was holding its breath. Once everything was closed and locked, I went upstairs. That alone was unsettling. I had no idea what I was protecting myself from, but the fact that my dad wanted me upstairs made it feel serious. I stayed in one of the bedrooms, hovering near the window, but not daring to open it, listening to every sound from outside. A few minutes later, my phone rang again. It was my dad. Again. This time his voice was steadier, but the words he said sent a cold wave through me. He told me that some police officers were going to be going through the side gate into our back garden to check the shed. He said he'd be home soon. Police? In our garden, checking our shed. My chest tightened. I felt my throat go dry. I didn't ask questions then either. I could tell from the way he spoke that whatever was happening wasn't something to discuss over the phone. I just agreed again and stayed where I was, sitting upstairs, feeling suddenly very small in my own house. From the upstairs window, I could see into part of the back garden. Not long after that call, I saw them, armed police. They moved carefully, deliberately, scanning the area, checking around the shed, communicating quietly with each other. Seeing armed officers in our garden was surreal. It felt wrong, like something that belonged on the news or in a movie, and not in the place where we had barbecues and hung laundry. I remember feeling frozen, watching without really understanding. My mind raced through possibilities, each worse than the last. Was someone hiding nearby? Had something happened on our street? Was there a danger I didn't know about? The fact that I had been sitting downstairs with everything open not long before made my skin crawl. Eventually, the police left the garden. The house was quiet again, but the quiet no longer felt peaceful. It felt heavy and charged, like the air before a storm. When my dad finally got home, I met him immediately, questions spilling out of me all at once. I needed to know what was going on. I needed context. The fear had nowhere to go without answers. He sat me down and explained. Earlier that day, a 16-year-old kid from our street had taken some legal highs. Something had gone wrong. Whether it was a bad reaction, a mental break, or a mix of things, no one knew for sure in the moment. What they did know was that he had stabbed a neighbor and then run. The police had flooded the area. Streets were blocked off. That's why my dad couldn't get onto our street when he first called. Officers believed the kid might be hiding nearby, possibly in gardens or sheds, anywhere he could fit. That's why they checked ours. As my dad explained everything, a delayed wave of fear washed over me. I had been home alone. All the doors and windows had been open. I had no idea anything was wrong. The thought hit me hard. If my dad hadn't called when he did, I would have stayed downstairs, completely unaware that someone dangerous was potentially hiding just meters away. The safety I had taken for granted that afternoon suddenly felt like an illusion. What made it even more unsettling was how close to home it all was. This wasn't some distant crime story. This was someone from our street, a kid, someone who probably walked past our house regularly, someone who lived close enough that police thought he might be hiding in our garden. That night, the full weight of it sank in. The police eventually found him after dark. According to what we were told later, he was scared of the dark and eventually came out of hiding on his own. There was something deeply sad about that detail. A violent, terrifying situation caused by a teenager who was still in some ways just a scared kid. That didn't erase what he'd done, or how dangerous the situation was, but it added a layer of sadness that was hard to ignore. Even so, the fear didn't disappear. For a long time afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about how easily things could have gone differently, how vulnerable I had been without realizing it, how safe I had felt simply because the setting was familiar and quiet. It made me question how much we rely on routine and assumptions to feel secure. I replayed the moment my dad called me again and again, the way his voice sounded, the way I knew instantly that this wasn't a joke, the way my body reacted before my mind fully caught up. I was grateful I listened without hesitation, grateful that instinct told me to obey first and ask questions later. After that day, I became much more aware of my surroundings, even in places I thought were completely safe. I stopped leaving everything open just because it was daytime. I started locking doors more often, checking windows, being more cautious when home alone. Not in a panicked way, but in a way that acknowledged reality rather than ignoring it. What stayed with me the most was how ordinary the day had been before everything changed. There was no warning, no strange noises, no feeling of danger in the air. Just a quiet village afternoon that, beneath the surface, had turned into something terrifying without me knowing. It taught me that safety isn't always about where you live or how nice the area is. Sometimes it's about timing, awareness, and listening when something feels off, even if you don't yet understand why. That afternoon ended without me being physically harmed, and for that I'm grateful. But the experience left a lasting mark. It stripped away the illusion that nothing bad could happen simply because it never had before. And it reminded me how quickly normal life can shift, how danger can exist just out of sight, and how important it is to trust the people who tell you to take it seriously. Even now, thinking back on it still makes my chest tighten slightly, not just because of the fear, but because of how close it all was, how quiet it was, and how easily it could have gone unnoticed if not for one phone call at exactly the right time. Compared to a lot of the stories people share, I know I've been pretty lucky. Nothing truly awful has ever happened to me. Still, there was one night that scared me so badly It changed how I look at technology, at silence, and at my own home. It was a normal evening, quiet in the way houses feel when the people you love aren't there. My wife had taken our son to visit her mother for the night, and I stayed home alone. I didn't mind. I had the house to myself, and I was looking forward to a calm evening, maybe watching TV or going to bed early. There was nothing about that night that felt strange or off at first. Our house was dark except for a few lamps. The air felt still. You notice silence more when you're alone, but it didn't bother me. I moved around the house like I always did, checking locks out of habit. I'm making sure everything was normal. Eventually I walked toward our bedroom to grab something before turning in for the night. That's when I saw the baby monitor screen. We keep a video baby monitor in our son's room, mostly for peace of mind. Even when he's not home, the camera stays on. The small screen sits on a dresser in our bedroom, angled so we can glance at it without thinking. That night, as I walked past it, something on the screen caught my eye. At first, my brain didn't fully register what I was seeing. Then it hit me. On the monitor, I could see someone inside my son's room. A figure was moving near his bed, bending down, shifting things around. It looked like someone rummaging, like they were searching through his room quietly, deliberately. The angle wasn't perfect, but there was no mistaking it. A person was in my house. My entire body went cold. That split second where your mind tries to reject reality was there, but it didn't last long. Adrenaline flooded in fast and hard. My heart slammed against my ribs. Every worst-case scenario rushed into my head at once. Someone had broken in. Someone was inside my home while I was alone. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my firearm from where I keep it secured and turned toward the hallway. My voice came out louder than I expected, sharp and commanding, echoing through the house. I shouted that I was armed. I shouted for whoever it was to come out slowly. I kept repeating it over and over, making sure my voice carried to the other side of the house. I wanted them to know I wasn't hiding. I wanted them to know I was ready. As I moved down the hallway, everything felt unreal. The house I knew so well suddenly felt unfamiliar, like it had too many corners, too many shadows. Every step felt heavy. I kept my eyes moving, scanning doorways, listening for any sound that didn't belong. The baby monitor screen stayed burned into my mind. I knew what I had seen. There was no doubt in my head that someone had been in that room. I reached my son's bedroom door. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to stay steady. I took a breath, reached for the switch, and flipped on the light. The room was empty. No movement, no person, no sign of anyone at all. The bed was untouched. The floor was clear. The closet door was open like it always is. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing looked wrong. For a moment I just stood there confused, heart racing so hard it hurt. My brain struggled to catch up. I had seen someone. I knew I had. And yet, the room was completely empty. I didn't relax. Instead, the fear deepened. If someone had been in the room, they could still be in the house. They could be hiding, waiting. I moved through the house carefully, checking every room, every closet, every space someone could possibly fit. My senses felt sharpened to an extreme. Every small noise sounded like a threat. The refrigerator hum, the house settling, my own breathing. I checked doors, locked, windows, secure. Nothing was open, nothing was broken, nothing made sense. By the time I finished searching the house, I was exhausted and soaked in adrenaline. My heart was still racing, but slowly, reluctantly, logic started to creep back in. Maybe I had misinterpreted what I saw. Maybe the shadows played tricks on me. Maybe the camera glitched. I tried to convince myself it was over. I went back to the bedroom, and that's when my blood ran cold all over again. On the baby monitor screen, the figure was back. Someone was standing in my son's room again, moving the same way, in the same spot. My stomach dropped. The fear came roaring back stronger than before. I felt stupid for doubting myself. Someone had been there the whole time. I stepped closer to the monitor. I stared harder. That's when something clicked. The movements felt familiar. The posture, the way the person turned, the timing felt wrong, slightly off, not live, like watching a recording that was lagging behind reality. My heart pounded as I leaned in closer. Slowly, painfully, the realization hit me. I was looking at myself. The baby monitor wasn't showing a live feed anymore. It was streaming on a massive delay. What I had seen the first time wasn't an intruder. It was me, earlier, walking through the room when I had checked on things without thinking. What I saw after clearing the house was the same delayed footage finally catching up. I stood there in silence, the truth sinking in, the fear draining out of me and leaving embarrassment behind in its place. My legs felt weak. I lowered myself onto the bed and let out a long breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I had gone looking for an intruder, and I had come back empty-handed because the intruder never existed. The strangest part is that the camera had never done that before, not once. It had always been live, always reliable, and it has never done it again since that night. No warning, no explanation. It just one terrifying delay that turned my own reflection into something out of a nightmare. Even knowing the truth, it took a long time for my nerves to settle. I kept replaying the moment I first saw the screen, the certainty I felt, the fear that took over my body. It was a reminder of how convincing fear can be when it has something visual to cling to. That night taught me something uncomfortable. Technology doesn't have to be broken to betray you. A simple delay, a few missing seconds, can turn your own house into a horror scene. And sometimes the thing you're most afraid of isn't an intruder or a stranger or a threat from the outside. Sometimes it's just you staring back at yourself out of time. I was babysitting one evening, a job I'd done plenty of times before and never really thought twice about. The parents had gone out for the night and had given me very specific instructions before leaving. Their child had a video monitor in her room, and they told me she usually slept through the night without any problems. If she woke up for any reason, they wanted me to call them immediately. They were calm about it, reassuring even, and nothing in their tone suggested there was anything unusual I needed to worry about. It all felt very routine. The house itself was quiet and comfortable, the kind of place that feels safe once the door closes behind the parents. After they left, I settled into the living room, turned on the TV, and set the baby monitor off to the side where I could easily glance at it. The screen showed the child sleeping peacefully in her crib, barely moving, the room softly lit by the night vision glow of the camera. Everything felt normal. I remember feeling relaxed, almost bored, the way you do when nothing is happening and you expect nothing to happen. The hours passed slowly. I flipped through channels, half watching whatever was on, occasionally glancing at the monitor just to make sure everything looked the same. Each time I looked, the child was still asleep. Her chest rose and fell gently, and the room was still. There were no strange noises, no movement, nothing that would suggest the night would turn into anything memorable. Around 11 o'clock, something changed. At first, it was so subtle that I wasn't even sure it was real. I glanced at the monitor like I had dozens of times already, and something felt off. The camera angle looked slightly different. Just a few inches, maybe, but enough that it caught my attention. The crib wasn't framed exactly the way it had been before. I frowned and leaned forward, squinting at the screen. My first thought was that maybe I had bumped the monitor or that the camera had shifted on its own somehow. Then it moved again. The image began to jiggle slightly, not enough to be obvious right away, but enough that my stomach tightened. It didn't look like the kind of glitch you see when a connection is bad. It looked like something was physically touching the camera. like someone was adjusting it by hand. The movement was small and deliberate, as if fingers were nudging it. I remember sitting there frozen, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. I stared at the screen, and my eyes narrowing, my heart starting to beat faster. I told myself it could be interference. Maybe the camera was loose. Maybe it was some kind of technical issue. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, especially ones that didn't make sense. Before I could fully process what I was seeing, the entire screen suddenly burst into static. It wasn't a slow fade or a mild distortion. 1 second I was staring at the child's room, and the next the screen was filled with harsh black and white noise. It lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. The sound from the monitor crackled sharply, filling the quiet living room with that awful, chaotic hiss. Then the static disappeared. The image came back just in time for me to see the child standing up in her crib. She was wide awake, screaming at the top of her lungs. It wasn't a soft cry or a confused whimper. It was full-on wailing, loud and panicked, the kind of scream that makes your chest tighten instantly. She looked terrified. Her face was red, her mouth open wide, her whole body tense as she screamed. The sound was so sudden and intense that it made me jump. For a split second I just sat there, staring at the monitor, my heart racing. The timing of it all felt wrong. The camera shifting, the static, and then, immediately, the child waking up and screaming like that. It felt like too much of a coincidence, and my brain struggled to make sense of it. I got up and paced the living room, torn between going into her room and staying where I was. The parents had told me to call them if she woke up, but I also didn't want to overreact if this was just a brief episode. I kept watching the monitor, hoping she would calm down on her own, hoping the screams would fade and she would lie back down. She didn't. Minutes passed, and her screaming didn't slow. She stayed standing in the crib, crying hysterically, her whole body shaking. The sound echoed through the house, filling every room with a sense of urgency and dread. I felt my hands start to sweat, my nerves completely shot. The image of the camera moving replayed in my mind over and over, and the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. Eventually I picked up my phone and called her mom. When she answered, I tried to explain what was happening, though I didn't mention the camera movement right away. I told her the child had woken up and was screaming and hadn't gone back to sleep. Her mom sounded tired but calm. She listened and then said something that surprised me. She told me not to worry. She said they were already on their way home anyway and that it was probably fine. According to her, the child sometimes had nightmares. It wasn't unusual for her to wake up screaming like that. She spoke as if this was something they were used to, something that didn't concern her much. I agreed, even though my stomach was still in knots. I stayed on the phone for a bit longer, listening to the child cry in the background, then hung up and continued watching the monitor. Eventually the screaming slowed, turning into sobs and then quieter cries. She didn't go back to sleep right away, but she did calm down enough that the situation felt less urgent. Still, the feeling in the room never went away. When the parents got home, I gave them a brief rundown of what happened. I mentioned that the child had woken up screaming and that I had called as instructed. I didn't go into detail about the camera movement or the static. I wasn't sure how to explain it without sounding dramatic or paranoid. They thanked me, reassured me again that it was normal, and paid me like everything had gone exactly as expected. I went home afterward, but sleep didn't come easily that night. I kept replaying the moment in my head, the slight shift of the camera, the way it jiggled, just enough to look intentional, the sudden burst of static that filled the screen, and then the child screaming in a way that felt raw and terrified, not like a mild nightmare. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself it was probably just a technical glitch, a coincidence paired with a child waking up from a bad dream. But no matter how many times I tried to explain it away, something about it didn't sit right. The idea that the camera moved on its own didn't make sense. The idea that it malfunctioned at the exact moment the child woke up screaming felt unlikely. And the thought that something or someone could have been messing with the monitor, even briefly, made my skin crawl. The worst part was that there was no way to know for sure. No clear explanation, no evidence. Just that unsettling sequence of events burned into my memory. After that night, I never babysat there again. I didn't make a big deal out of it. I didn't accuse anyone or tell a dramatic story. I just declined when they asked if I was available in the future. I told myself I was busy, that my schedule had changed. It was easier than trying to explain why the house made me uncomfortable now. Even years later, the memory still unsettles me. Not because anything objectively terrible happened, but because of how helpless and strange it felt. I was alone in someone else's house, watching a child sleep through a camera, trusting that everything was normal. And then, in a matter of seconds, that sense of control vanished. Technology, which was supposed to provide reassurance, suddenly became the source of fear. What bothered me most was how quickly the atmosphere changed. One moment I was relaxed, half watching TV, barely paying attention. The next, my heart was racing, my nerves were shot, and I felt like something was deeply wrong, even though I couldn't explain why. That shift, that sudden loss of comfort, stayed with me long after the night was over. I still think about how vulnerable that situation felt, how easily something strange slipped into what should have been an ordinary night, how a few inches of camera movement and a burst of static were enough to turn a calm evening into something I never wanted to repeat. Whatever the explanation was, logical or not, I know one thing for sure. That night left me with a deep sense of unease that I couldn't shake. And no matter how many times I tell myself it was probably nothing, the feeling it left behind is very real. Never again. The story ends here. If this one stayed with you, please leave a comment. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe so you are here for the next one. Until then, stay safe.